Hi there, and welcome to what is essentially going to be a guide about Raiden, her teams, and her particular character synergies. I was planning to talk about a lot more with this character because there's a lot more detail to explain, but it has been done before by other people, and frankly better, and it would make the video way too long. So I decided instead to just talk about her teams and her characters because a lot of what makes Raiden good can be ascertained from that information alone. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Raiden and what she does in terms of what roles she performs many different roles, which has helped make her so versatile and so strong over the years. Her first and most obvious role is an on-field damage dealer when she's using her burst. You press her burst, you hit a lot of people with her magic electro sword, and you do a lot of damage for a few seconds before you swap back off. That's a part of her kit. The other part is the support roles, and she does two things particularly by design, that is, buff everyone else's burst damage, and also generate energy, and she generates energy through multiple means. The first is through the generation of particles from her skill, which works off-field and pretty much has 100% uptime, but also from her burst when she's on-field dealing damage. A portion of her hits will be changed into flat energy for her entire team, so she helps bring down the energy costs of her entire team by quite a fair chunk, which is what has made her particularly valuable as a driver for certain teams like the national team variation, or for other teams that have a lot of burst heavy units like Double Hydra with Yelan and Xingqiu. I'll get into more about that later on. But ultimately, that's what her intended role is, but she also has other roles in the form of just using her skill alone, because her skill allows her to be an electro applicator without applying too much electro that overtakes certain auras, which allows her to be the trigger of certain reactions. In particular, the reaction known as Hyper Bloom has what's given her a new lease in life in terms of her role in the meta. Instead of just being used as an on-field burst damage dealer and burst damage buffer for the rest of the team, she can still buff the rest of the team's damage, but she also ends up being an entirely off-field Hyper Bloom trigger, dealing damage through Hyper Bloom seeds, and I'll explain and showcase that throughout the video as well. Now, before I get into the character synergies, because it's going to take most of the video, I'll talk very briefly about her teams. I mentioned the national team, but if you're not familiar with what that is, it is essentially a team that is built around 3 4-star units known as Bennett, Xingqiu, and Zhanling, in order to allow Zhanling to consistently vaporize while also taking advantage of Bennett's buff. And vaporize is a very strong amplifying reaction for Pyro units. What Raiden allows you to do is also overload, as well as vaporize with Zhanling, which increases her own damage further. It also brings down the energy costs of everybody on that team, and you have a very powerful on-field driver who takes advantage of Bennett's buff, cannot be interrupted when she's in her burst except by dying, and also generates quite a few particles herself. So that's national, and that's why it's such a particularly favoured team. It's very easy to play, it's very new player friendly in terms of the units required, so that's probably one of her most common archetypes for people. The other one is more specifically for Raiden's vertical investment, and that is Raiden Hyper. You've probably seen it a fair bit with whales who play, or people with Raidens like myself, C2. And that includes Bennett and Kazuha for buffing Raiden's raw damage, as well as using typically C6 Sara, because at C6 Sara also buffs Raiden's crit damage for the duration of her burst. And that's a very powerful team in of itself, but it's one that almost entirely funnels all of the damage into Raiden herself, with, to some degree, some damage coming from Kazuha as well in AoE.
The world remains constant over the centuries.
Now, her most common, or probably most recommended team comp now that Dendro is out is using her not for her burst at all, but for her skill, where she is the Hyper Bloom trigger. And what Hyper Bloom generally is that you generate seeds through the Dendro and Hydra reaction, and then you use an Electro character to trigger the seeds into more powerful, effectively Dendro missiles that will home in on the enemy. And if you're generating a lot of seeds, Raiden is quite capable at triggering them herself. She can do this quite rapidly, she barely needs any field time at all, and it makes her quite convenient to work with other units that require field time or take advantage of field time. It's given her a lot more versatility in terms of teams, but those aren't the only teams you can run her in. There's also a particular favourite of mine, which is taser variations. These can either be double hydro or double electro, but they generally involve taking advantage of the electrocharge reactions combination of two auras to double swirl with an Anemo unit, buffing both of the elements, and then just doing raw hydro and electro damage. It's quite easy to play and there's a lot of team with diversity in that regard, so it became something of a favourite of mine, especially when Farina and Yelan came. Now, Hyperbloom isn't Raiden's only Dendro team. There is also the variations of Quicken, which is a reaction that adds extra damage to electro hits. And then there is Quick Bloom, which combines Aggravate, which is the Quicken reaction for electro, as well as Hyperbloom. So you, in a way, get something of a best of both worlds, although in reality they tend to be more Quicken focused than Bloom focused. It's just you get to take advantage of Hydro units and the damage of Hyperbloom on top of your Quickens. Now, I've probably showcased some of these teams in the video as I've been talking, so you'll have a good idea of how these teams actually generally play in practice. So let's go talk about the character synergies now in more detail about how they work and why they work with Raiden. Okay, so let's start with the Electro Characters. First of all, one of the most important and useful Electro Characters is actually Fischl, which post-Dendro shouldn't actually be a surprise to anyone, because basically as soon as Aggravate was a thing, Fischl skyrocketed in terms of her usefulness. She was already a good character, and then Dendro made her an exceptionally good character. And while she's not typically used with Raiden, she does still have pretty good synergy with her because of her A4 passive triggering consistently on electro reactions when triggered by an on-fielder, which Raiden in her burst is an on-fielder triggering electro reactions, so that does count. And talking about Quicken and Aggravate, if you are playing Raiden and an Aggravate or a Quick Bloom team, Fischl, well, probably not so much in Quick Bloom, but in Aggravate you definitely want Fischl. Aggravate without Fischl is significantly worse unless you have like an outrageous amount of investment in, say, a C6 Sara or another off-fielder, but otherwise Fischl is the premium option for the off-field electro damage in an Aggravate team. So if you're using Raiden in Aggravate, you're using Raiden with Fischl almost all the time. Otherwise, she can be a very good alternative to Sara in Raiden Hyper, or similar teams, because without C6 Sara, I'll get to that in a moment. Without C6 Sara, there isn't really a lot of point to using Sara as a buffer, because she's just not providing enough to that team to warrant how much her burst actually costs, how much it costs to build her, how clunky she is to actually use. Whereas Fischl isn't clunky in the slightest, and her damage in that team definitely warrants putting her in that slot over Sara, so that's another option. As for her other Aggravate or well, non-Aggravate and non-Hyper teams, she doesn't see that much use, but ultimately, like any team where you're using like a burst DPS Raiden and she's on field, triggering electro reactions, Fischl is almost never a bad choice, so using them together is generally quite a good idea. Now Beidou. Beidou is an interesting one because ultimately she was, in theory, supposed to be very good with Burst Raiden, but unfortunately MiHoYo decided in their infinite wisdom that they weren't going to make Raiden's Burst able to trigger Beidou's Burst because for some reason her normal attacks don't count as normal attacks. Now, that's a long story with its own controversy, but generally speaking, if you want to use Burst Raiden, you're probably not going to use her with Beidou. However, that doesn't mean Beidou has no synergy with Raiden whatsoever, because with Dendro, she does actually have a team where she uses Raiden, and that is in Hyperbloom. The way Beidou's Burst works means that it will almost, in fact, it basically will never, trigger the seeds by itself. So in double Electro Hyper Bloom teams, she more or less ensures that Raiden is always the trigger of the Hyper Blooms, which is what you want. But at the same time, she's still benefiting from Raiden's burst damage buffing, which she does through her skill anyway, without any artifact investment required for that. So Beidou can still do considerable damage and benefit from Raiden's support, but she won't interfere with Raiden doing her thing, which is triggering the Hyper Bloom seeds. So that's one instance where you can use Beidou with Raiden and it will work, otherwise it is just not recommended. Now, with Kuki, technically speaking, if you're not using Kuki as a Hyper Bloom trigger, she can work with Raiden as a healer, but I wouldn't recommend it just because you have other better options for healers in that regard. And of course, if you're using Kuki as a Hyper Bloom trigger, then you're not using her with Raiden, because whether you're using Raiden in a Hyper Bloom build or a Burst build, Raiden is going to be stealing seeds from her. So there's ultimately no real point in using Kuki with Raiden in that capacity, and otherwise she's just a generally worse healer option than your other options. So I wouldn't recommend using Kuki with Raiden, even though technically you can make it work. Lisa is another interesting one. Lisa generally gets disregarded as kind of a mediocre standard character that everybody gets for free, but ultimately she does have some advantages. Namely that she shreds defense on enemies that get hit by her burst at A4, which means that she will be able to shred defense no matter what talent or artifact investment you have, as long as you have it at A4. Which means, in a way, she can act as a debuffer for Raiden. So she becomes another alternative to using Sarah in hyper teams, as long as you're getting enough energy to consistently burst with her, which with Raiden you probably should. But also, you can give her thrilling tails, and that way she also becomes an attack buffer, which isn't as impactful as it normally would be if you're already using Bennett, but it still has an impact. So, again, if you don't have C6 Sarah, Lisa is an option instead that will perform quite well. Otherwise, again, I wouldn't really recommend using her outside of that, particularly not with Hyper Bloom, because Lisa can also pretty reliably, although not as regularly as Raiden herself, trigger Hyper Blooms, so it can be a fight over ownership of the seeds. Keqing, there's basically no real synergy I can think of with her teams and Raiden teams. There is a reason you basically don't see them get played together. They don't have any particular synergy that I can think of off the top of my head in teams where they're both in the same team. However, it is worth mentioning that Keqing does have a very good team now in the form of Aggravate. She is a very good Aggravate driver. So what you can do instead is you can use Keqing in an Aggravate team and then use Raiden in another team, such as a Hyper Bloom team or National or Double Hydra, whatever it may be, but ultimately she does free up a lot of good supports in the form of Bennett, in the form of Xingqiu, Yelan, Farina, that you'd probably otherwise want to use with characters. Well, you could then use them with Raiden, because Keqing can take Fischl, she can take a lot of Dendro characters like Kirara or Yao Yao and run a team just fine there. So I suppose it's worth mentioning in that capacity that she has a synergy in the sense that she can run alongside Raiden in the Abyss without taking too many of the supports that Raiden wants to use. Dori, basically the same thing I'd say about Kuki, but Dori's basically a worse Kuki. Razor, again, not really a lot of synergy that I could really particularly mention. However, Razor does have his own on-field Hyper Burgeon teams, what Zajeff called Thundering Fury. If you want to know more about that, I just recommend watching his videos about that team. But in the same capacity as Keqing, taking a lot of supports that Raiden doesn't typically need, although to a lesser extent because it requires Bennett, you can make different teams based around these two characters, and that can generally do a pretty good job of helping you into this. Now, on this list, I've saved Sarah for last because ultimately there's very little to say about her that I haven't already said by talking about other characters, but if you do have her C6, like I do, she is a very potent buffer for certain teams. Now, her typical team is Raiden Hyper, but as I've probably already mentioned, I'm not particularly keen on the normal form of Raiden Hyper. However, with Farina and Jean, you have another option that performs basically in a very similar capacity, but without the downsides of overload and, in my mind, playing a bit more smoothly. So I like using this team with Sarah. So I figure it's worth mentioning at least in that degree. If you have a C6 Sarah that you haven't built yet, well, she is actually a very good buffer for Raiden, so in that particular context, yes, Sarah is quite good with Raiden. However, outside of that, I do not recommend using her because she just doesn't provide enough otherwise. Now, I'm going to go cover the characters I haven't mentioned because on this account I don't have them. I have Yai on my other account, but not on this one. But I also have Sino on that account, but again, Sino is one of those characters where he doesn't particularly get run in teams with Raiden, because his teams without Raiden are generally the ones you want to run, so it becomes a case of you use him on the other team, not in a team with Raiden. So it's really up to you. So, Yai Miko, on the other hand, she kind of has a foot in both camps. She can and does work well with Raiden, but she also works just fine without her. Now, the particular teams to mention with Yai Miko and Raiden being in the same team are, well, I'm obviously going to mention Taser, because when it comes to just raw electro damage, Taser teams are generally the formula you take, because it just becomes so easy to double swirl Electro and Hydro. But there's also a team I probably haven't mentioned too much, which is Mono Electro. And that's, before Dendro, that was basically the clearest design philosophy for Yai, in that she was supposed to be used with Raiden with her massive 90 cost burst, but also didn't take up a considerable amount of field time, with most of her damage being off-field. So that leaves plenty of time for a burst Raiden to be on-field, and before Dendro, that was basically the only build he ran on Raiden. So that would be Raiden, Yai Miko, and typically I would have said Sarah and Jean, although if you feel you don't need the healing, then you can run Kazuha, I suppose. But, yeah, I'm not a particular fan of Mono Electro just because they have so many better options now with Dendro and with the Hydro characters we have. Like, Hydro characters are so incredibly strong that using them in Electro Charge teams, like, you still just get so much damage, and it's just so easy to buff both Hydro and Electro. I don't really recommend Mono Electro, but it is an option. You can run it. Now, moving on to the Hydro characters and their synergies with Raiden. In a way, this will probably be a little bit faster than the Electro ones, because for the most part, they all fit into various different groups in terms of their usefulness. Some being enablers, some being off-field damage dealers. You get the idea. We can talk about a lot of characters at the same time. So, without further ado, let's talk about the holy trinity of Hydro characters. That is to say, the father, the Son, ignore the fact that she's an older woman, and the Holy Spirit of off-field Hydro damage and application. So Shincho is one of the older ones, and talking about why he's good is going to help explain why a lot of the others are also good. His off-field Hydro application is incredibly strong, his off-field Hydro damage is strong even without buffing, and he also provides a lot of other defensive utilities that are specific to him, such as interrupt resistance, which Raiden doesn't particularly need when she's on-field bursting, but other on-fielders do want quite a bit because it's very handy. As well as the fact that he gives an incredible amount of damage reduction just on his own, and if you pair him up with Beidou, your on-fielder is basically taking no damage whatsoever. So there's a reason why this guy has been used for so long with so many carries, because he's just exceptional in his own right. And he particularly has good synergy with Raiden because a lot of his damage comes from his burst, which, no matter what Raiden build you're running, Raiden is always buffing your character's bursts quite considerably. And the fact that it is 80 cost also buffs Raiden's resolve stacks quite significantly as well. So just in almost any team you're going to run her in, whether she's EM or whether she's like on-field bursting, Xingqiu is incredibly good at that. So moving on to some of the others and how they differ, well, there's the Yalan. Now, Yalan doesn't have the same defensive utility as Xingqiu, but she does have other advantages. She provides an unconditional damage buff to the on-fielder that ramps up to 50%, but in reality you're going to be probably hovering around 30 to 35%, but, you know, ramping up near the end of your rotation. She has a lot more agility within her skill, which has its usefulness when you're having to dart around the abyss after her enemies, or when there's, like, new waves popping in. That mobility comes in handy quite a bit. And there's the fact that she herself tends to do more damage than Xingqiu, and unless he's C6, in which case it's about the same unless you have more constellations on your Yalan. But she is an acceptable substitute, but also they work well together as a pair. And a lot of times you can just have Yalan and Xingqiu as your off-field damage dealers and then have anybody on-field. But for the same reasons I was talking about Xingqiu's synergy with Raiden in terms of burst damage buffing and resolve stack generation, Yalan has those advantages as well. So both of them together work very well with Raiden, and then you can just have someone like Jean or Kazuha if you want, you know, if you don't really care about defensive utility, and just go nuts on anybody who's on field. That's a team I've run before, and it works very well. Now, more recently, we've had, of course, the Hydra Archon, Furina. Now, Furina is similar in terms of what she does, but she's also quite different. First off, she's more of a buffer than she is a damage dealer, although her damage dealing is good. It's just that her main role is to provide team-wide damage buffing, and she buffs your damage considerably. Like, imagine Kazuha's buff, but basically 50% more on that, unconditionally other than healing your team. Which is why these two often get paired together, Furina and Jean, because Furina offers such a massive damage buff, and Jean meets that condition on top of providing VV shredding of resistances. So this is why this is a particular favourite team of mine, using these four characters together, because you're getting a similar kind of damage to what you'd be getting out of Raiden Hyper, but without needing overload, without worrying about being vaporized by the Tulpa or whatever in the current abyss. And it's just like one of the easiest teams in the world to play. So these three are very good with Raiden. And again, Furina's burst costs quite a bit and it's important, so she does benefit from Raiden's energy generation, and she also provides resolve stacks. She's not getting any damage from the burst damage buffing, but ultimately that's not her point. She's more of a buffer than she is a damage dealer herself, but her damage is quite good. Now that covers those main three. I have some others here. Let's get through some of the easy ones quickly. Nilu, don't. Barbara, basically don't. Now Kokomi. Kokomi is a little bit of a... She does have synergy with both versions of Raiden, but it depends on what you need in a team. Do you need a healer who can, you know, have an on-field presence with off-field and on-field Hydra application that's good in AoE? Well, Kokomi is a very good character in that regard. She fits well in Hyper Blue, so she works with EM Raiden, but she also works reasonably well with a burst damage Raiden, although because of the way her skill works and how her burst works, for those not familiar, Kokomi has a mechanic where she can refresh the duration of her skill, which otherwise kind of peters out and stops existing halfway through her cooldowns, by using her burst. So because of that, you're kind of encouraged to use Kokomi's skill early, and then refresh the skill with her burst after that, and then start using Raiden stuff. It may seem a bit weird at first to use a burst that encourages you to be on field, and then immediately swap off it, but with Kokomi that's a legitimate way of playing because of how it refreshes her skill. And it also means she's not then stealing field time from Raiden, who, if you're using her as your burst damage dealer, that's the character you want to be spending field time on. Now, I have neglected Kandaka, or Candace, or however you want to pronounce that name, but that's mainly because this is a very, very niche character that's kind of only used in Nilu Bloom teams, and even then, I tend to prefer Kokomi myself. So my answer would just be don't, unless you have no better option. Now, there are some other characters I don't have on this account, although I do have Neuvillette and Tartaglia and Mona on my other one. I just can't be bothered getting them up. So let's talk about these three together, because they kind of do the same thing of being an on-field hydro damage dealer and enabler. Now, as for synergies with Raiden, it's mainly these two more so than Child. Child doesn't really get used with Raiden a lot, although technically he can be. But usually, if you use these two characters with Raiden, it's then being used in a Hyper Bloom team. So let's talk about that. Well, they're on-field hydro damage dealers and enablers with their own various advantages, Neuvillette being the current favourite at the moment because of the sheer amount of damage he does so easily even without buffs. But he also has a lot of very good synergy with Farina, so he's even better when you use him with Farina. But ultimately they will both work at doing the same thing, which is just being on-field, doing hydro damage, driving Hyper Bloom reactions with Raiden being the trigger. Now the reason I mention them alongside Tartaglia, or Child, is that as much as you kinda don't want to do this team with Child, his Vaporized teams are just a lot better. You can technically use him in a Hyper Bloom team, although I wouldn't use him alone in a Hyper Bloom team. Because while, yeah, he provides a lot of hydro application in an AoE on the field, his cooldowns can be very restrictive, and in Hyper Bloom you just want to be generating as many seeds as possible, because that's your main source of damage. Or at least it's a considerable chunk of it. So you want as much Dendro as possible, and you want as much Hydro as possible all the time, because there's basically no downtime in Hyper Bloom teams. So if you use him alongside another off-field Hydro character like Chincho or Yelan, then you're not going to notice the issues he has with cooldowns all that often, and, you know, he can then swap to being on-field, doing a lot of damage. However, I would say if you do have these characters anyway, they can kind of just carry a Hyper Bloom team on their own, and then you can just use Child in a Vaporized team, or a Burgeon team. He has a Burgeon team, and it's quite decent. So it depends. Like, if you really don't want to use that team, and you're thinking, well, I wouldn't mind using him in a Hyper Bloom team, then yes, it does work. But it's just, if you have these two, they basically just do the same job, but better in terms of ensuring you're generating seeds all the time. And last but not least is Mona. I mean, in the same way as Barbara, I'd just say no when it comes to using her with Raiden. However, you can technically use her for, like, burst damage, just making the numbers go as high as possible with Raiden's raw damage, but there's just better ways to do that than using Mona, because Mona doesn't really generate a lot of energy herself, and even with Raiden, she's just going to struggle to keep getting that burst up. So I would recommend against it, although technically you can make it work. So now we talked about Raiden's synergy with Hydro characters and other Electro characters. Now let's move on to the Dendro characters, because of course for one of her different builds you can run, Dendro characters are crucial to how she works. If you want to run Hyper Bloom Raiden, you've got to use Dendro in order to make that work, because it's obviously a Dendro reaction. Now on display here I don't have that many Dendro characters on this account, but ultimately these ones here are still quite important, particularly these two, which I will talk about in more extended detail, but I will mention Cole and Dendro Traveler here, because these two are the ones you get for free, regardless of what account you are. They're always there. And using the two of them together does help offset some of the issues they have with off-field Dendro application uptime, as well as the rate at which it is applied. Because with Bloom teams, you want to be applying as much Dendro and as much Hydro as possible, because your damage is tied to your seeds, and if you're not proccing seeds after seeds after seeds, then your damage, it suffers because of it. So Dendro application, especially off-field Dendro application, is very valuable. But Raiden doesn't really take a lot of field time, or any field time really, when she's on a Hyper Bloom team. So it allows a bit more flexibility in terms of whether you use your Dendro characters on-field or off-field. Nevertheless, using two Dendro characters together does help with Dendro application in general, obviously, as well as ensuring that your Dendro characters get enough energy to keep using their bursts, as well as ensuring that you can also generate, well, not generate, you can also buff your Hyper Bloom trigger with Elemental Mastery, because of course Dendro Resonance gives an EM buff to your team, which is significant when it comes to triggers such as Raiden. So I mention these two because of that, because every single team, every single account can use these two for a Hyper Bloom team with Raiden, and then somebody like even Barbara as like an on-fielder, you know, spreading Hydro reactions. That's a legitimate team you can run in order to generate enough blooms to clear the Abyss, and that's using mostly free-to-play characters. The only non-free-to-play character in that team is Raiden. So I'm not sure if I mentioned teams already before this discussion, but as much as you have Raiden National as a free-to-play option where your only 5-star is Raiden, well, the same is true for Hyper Bloom. You can make a free-to-play Hyper Bloom team where your only 5-star is Raiden, and it will clear through the Abyss. But of course, some Dendro characters are better than others, and basically there are almost none that are better than Nahida, especially when it comes to Bloom teams. I think when it comes to Bloom teams, there is no better character to have than Nahida, because her Dendro application, on-field or off-field, is just second to none. She just applies so much Dendro so easily, with how her skill applies a mark to every single enemy. Every time there's a reaction being triggered or you're hitting any of her Dendro seeds, she applies Dendro herself. There's no... well, there is an ICD on that, but you're normally not going to feel it. And as well as the fact that if you use her on-field as a driver, which is typically how I tend to use her, she's also applying Dendro with her normal attacks and charge attacks. I'm not sure if I explain what internal cooldowns are, but when it comes to applying elements, there's a set limit on how often you can do that, depending on hits or time. But there are different ways of getting around that, such as either characters that just ignore it altogether, like Zhan Ling, or characters who, or just by using various different ways of applying elements. And Catalyst users are very good at this, because unlike a lot of other characters that rely on infusions, Catalyst characters have infusions all the time. So their normal attacks, their charge attacks, they're different ways of applying their element, and they all have their own separate internal cooldowns. So when it comes to using Nahida on field, she just applies an absurd amount of Dendro, as well as the fact that her skill technically applies more Dendro than most other characters can in this game. So she has an inherent advantage in that regard. So when it comes to applying Dendro, Nahida's one of the best characters for that. In fact, no, she is the best. Not to mention the fact that her buff is a very powerful EM buff, or any on-fielder, including herself, and she also receives various different buffs to her skill depending on what teammate she's with. So, in general, yeah, one of the best Dendro characters. If you manage to have the opportunity to pick up Raiden and Nahida for a Hyper Bloom team, I do recommend you do that. But there are teams where Nahida is less valuable, and I will get into those in a moment, but one of them is Quicken teams. Because she applies so much Dendro, if you're running an Aggravate team, then there's not really a good opportunity for your Anemo character to swirl an element, because obviously they can't swirl Dendro. But if there's a Dendro aura, it can be difficult to have an aura that coexists with that. You can, to an extent, have Quicken with an Electro aura, but typically it's difficult to get to that scenario where you can swirl Electro off of Quicken aura, because they're separate things. So that's where a character like Yao Yao comes in. Now Yao Yao, she has decent off-field Dendro application, although it's not amazing. She has pretty good on-field Dendro application when she's using her burst, because her burst, it spawns multiple little rabbits that are on her shoulder. But as much as they all share an ICD, if you hit different enemies, those different enemies have a separate ICD. So if you're in multi-wave enemy content and you're running Bloom Team, well, all of those different rabbits are going to hit different enemies and they're going to apply Dendro, so you're generating more seeds than you would if it was just one enemy. But I digress. In terms of her Quicken teams, she fills a niche that for a long time was desired but didn't really have a character for it, which was a Dendro healer. Because in aggravate teams, what you typically want is your on-field Electro character, being the damage dealer. You have Fischl being off-field Electro damage because her A4 is just so incredibly broken. And then you have an Anemo buffer because both of the ones you'd use, like Sucrose and Kazuha, they're just incredibly good at buffing those teams. Like, both of them are so valuable that you will want to use at least one of them, rather than replace them with another Anemo character. So, well, in that scenario, who's your healer? Well, it should ideally be your Dendro character. But until Yao Yao, that didn't really exist, and then Yao Yao came out, and she's pretty damn good at filling that role, so... Now, I've been speaking about aggravate teams generally, and yes, Raiden does have an aggravate team. As much as she herself doesn't really get boosted too much in terms of her damage output by aggravate, she's an exceptionally good driver for it anyway. So in those teams, Yao Yao ends up being pretty capable, especially since if you need the emergency healing, well, you use her burst, you run around for a bit until everybody's healed, and then you go back to doing your normal things, and those generate resolve stacks for Raiden, so there is a benefit to her doing that even if she's taking up field time. Now, obviously, field time might be a bit of an issue, so maybe the fact that Yao Yao requires so much field time to do her healing in an emergency situation is too much of a drawback. Well, you have other options. One of them is Kirara, who is a Dendro shielder. She doesn't provide healing, but she does stop you taking damage. Her shield can be quite capable of doing that. So instead of the defensive support being healing, it's shielding, so you stop taking damage, but ultimately it's still the same role being filled that you would want someone like Yao Yao or Baizhu to do. Now, for Bloom teams, I don't think she really applies enough Dendro to make her particularly valuable in those teams, at least not on her own. But in Quicken teams, you don't need that much Dendro applied. You only really need enough to maintain the Quicken aura, which can exist for, I think, roughly 7 seconds, as long as it's not being drained too rapidly. But ultimately, Kirara should be able to enable that just fine. Now, Baizhu. Baizhu is effectively a Yao Yao that doesn't take field time to heal up the whole team, and his strengths are generally similar to Yao Yao. One thing I haven't mentioned about Yao Yao, but I will mention about Baizhu, is it applies to both of them, is that when they're solo Dendro in a Hyper Bloom team, they can actually be quite capable drivers. The difference with, of course, with Yao Yao is that with Yao Yao you need to be using her burst, because without her burst she's not applying enough Dendro to really be the solo Dendro generating blooms. But if you're using a burst all the time, and Raiden does generate energy, then you do get to do that quite often. But also, like, you usually run Favonius Lance on her anyway, just to lower her energy requirements. But Baizhu doesn't need to use his burst to do that. He's a Catalyst user, so he has the same advantages as Nahida in terms of being able to drive with his normal and charge attacks. Although he's not as good at that because his range is quite limited, and of course a lot of Nahida's application comes from her skill being procced, and Baiju's skill doesn't quite have the same advantages, although it is a solid skill in and of itself. What Baizhu really comes in handy for is quick bloom teams, particularly with Farina, because Farina offers this massive damage buff for any on-field, in fact the entire team, but she also has the condition of needing a team-wide healer, and ideally one that doesn't take a whole lot of field time. Well, that's Baizhu in a nutshell. And since Farina's Hydro and Baiju's Dendro, well, you have the core components for generating Bloom Seeds, which Raiden can then trigger. And then you have 3 characters that basically don't take field time, and they can all enable Hyper Bloom for an on-fielder. Or Quick Bloom, depending on what you want to do. And Quicken isn't just aggravate with an Electro driver, it can also be spread with a Dendro driver, which brings us to these two, Tignari and Alhaitham. Now, Alhaitham is a little bit more versatile than Tignari because of the fact that he's a sword user who uses normal and discharge attacks. He isn't just limited to charge attacks like Tignari is. So he can be a driver with various different units like Xingqiu and Yalan, which allows him to be quite a capable Hyper Bloom driver, not just a Quick Bloom. But his damage in Quicken teams is quite significant, so Quick Bloom is probably his best team in terms of getting the best of both worlds. You get the Blooms, which also do a considerable amount of damage, but you also get to take advantage of Alhaitham's significant damage through spread. Now, with Tignari, you get the similar advantages. He didn't really have a team outside of spread teams until Farina came out, because Farina, she behaves a bit like Xingqiu and Yalan, but she doesn't have the requirement to do normal attacks. In fact, she doesn't have the requirement that you do any attacks at all. She'll just attack on her own. So Tignari can do whatever he wants on field, and Farina will just do her thing. So using him with Raiden, Farina, and ideally Baiju, but you can get by with Yao Yao, to do a Quick Balloon team, that could be pretty damn strong. And since Tignari is a standard banner character, there's a good chance that over time you will probably get at least a C0 copy of it. And if you're sat there thinking, well, what do I do with this guy? Well, he's got very good spread teams with Raiden, because Dendro enablers in spread teams don't really care about using Fischl. They can, but they can't trigger her A4 passive, which makes her truly like mandatory in aggravate teams. So in spread teams, it's more a case of just ensuring that you maintain the Quicken aura, and Raiden also provides a pretty significant burst damage buff, so there is that. But he also has a Quick Bloom team, where if you're using Farina, and you can deal with the healing requirement, it ends up being a very strong team for Tignari. Now, out of all of these characters, I've saved Calvé for last, mainly because there isn't really a whole lot I can say about him. The way he was designed was kind of a bit like a normal, like, non-Hyper Bloom team, where you're generating blooms, but the blooms rupture by themselves and he can trigger them himself. But it's just not a very strong team, so in reality, the best way to play Kave is to ignore that part of him and just use him as a Dendro driver, because he gains an infusion when he uses his burst, which allows him to take the same advantages as Alhaitham or like a Catalyst user, and just apply Dendro while he's on field with his big sweeping Claymore hits. And it works, but it's just, when it comes to that kind of role, you've got a lot of better options, so it's only really if you haven't got someone like Alhaitham or Baiju on Ida, or you just really like Kave. So now we've talked about all of those main elements to synergize with Electro, let's talk about the one that synergizes with basically anything that it can trigger a reaction off of, and that is Anemo. Now, what makes Anemo so special? Well, various different reasons, but the two main ones come from resistance shredding and crowd control. Now, there's only certain Anemo units that can fully make use of crowd control, which in my mind would be Kazuha, Venti, and Sucrose, with a lot of the others having crowd control that's really too limited to make full use of, but ultimately that is Anemo's monopoly. Now, another thing is the existence of this particular set called Viridescent Venera, which is, depending on who you ask, it's the most broken artifact set in the game, because, well, you see the 4-piece here. It says decreases opponent's elemental resistance to the element infused in a swirl by 40% for 10 seconds. Which is a significant amount of resistance shred, especially considering that most enemies in this game have only an inherent 10% resistance shredding. So just swirling them once imps their resistance to whatever element you swirl for a considerably long time. 10 seconds is usually half of a rotation. Now, what it doesn't tell you here is that there is no real limit on how many elements you can swirl. As long as you can swirl different elements, you will shred that resistance, which becomes incredibly handy in cases where you can double swirl, either Pyro and Hydro for vaporized teams, Pyro and Cryo for melt teams, although that one's a little bit trickier, or the incredibly easy Electro and Hydro because of Electro Charged, allowing both auras to coexist. Double swirling both elements becomes extremely easy. Now, that should helpfully explain why Anemo in general is very strong. But these two characters here, in particular, Sucrose and Kazuha, they do a little bit more than just that. Like, they have CC and they have access to Viridescent Venera for the resistant shredding, but they also have a little bit more. Now, Kazuha is quite well known already, but in case you don't know what he does boost your damage bonus based off of elements that are swirled, and much like with Viridescent Venera, there's no limit to how many that can be. It can be multiple elements, it can, depending on what auras the enemies have on them, it can be like 3 elements. But in reality, you're more likely to get 2 rather than anything else, because ultimately, double swirling, or swirling at all, is dependent on what enemy you're fighting and what team you have and how much of an aura of an element you are applying. Because there are different auras that control how much of an element remains once you're triggering reactions, or how much time passes. Sucrose does a similar thing. At C6 she can actually boost your damage bonus by 20% if it infuses in the burst. But at C0 what she does is she increases your team's elemental mastery. Now for Raiden, that traditionally didn't mean a damn thing. Like, that ultimately did not matter for Raiden before Dendro, but because of Dendro, EM became a lot more useful for Electro Characters, not just for Bloom, but also for Quicken. So Sucrose as a buffer for Raiden becomes a bit more valuable in that regard, but as a Catalyst user, she's also quite valuable for holding Thrilling Tales, which gives quite a significant attack boost, so she can be a buffer in that regard, by virtue of being a Catalyst user. Now, I mention these two together because of the fact they play similar roles, but they do ultimately have different use cases in terms of what teams you want. With the answer being, if Elemental Mastery is useful for a team, depending on how useful it is, then Sucrose becomes a viable option for buffing Raiden. In teams where Elemental Mastery is not important for Raiden, it's Kazuha that you want, because if it's a Raiden Hyper team, or it's Mono Electro, or it's Taser, which is to say Electro and Hydro, then ultimately reaction damage doesn't really matter that much, you're just after boosting the raw damage, in which case that's what Kazuha does, and that's what he does best. With Sucrose, she can buff. I'll go through this in detail as well here. Like, it's not just Thrilling Tales that she has access to, but she also has access to Hakushin Ring, which offers quite a considerable damage bonus on top of what she already offers inherently through her kit and through her C6. But that's specifically for Electro characters, mainly. Well, in teams where you're doing Electro reactions. In fact, this can also be used to buff the damage bonus of Dendro teams, even though Anemo characters can't swirl Dendro, this allows you to boost Dendro damage as long as you're triggering an Electro reaction. But that's getting very specific about what certain qualities Sucrose can have as a Catalyst user and an Anemo character. But those qualities together make her very useful as a buffer, but then there's the fact that her kit inherently is very good at buffing. It's just, are the things that she's providing valuable to Raiden? Well, it depends on what team you're running her in. So, these two together, they perform a very similar role. It's just team dependent which one you want. Now, Venti is a bit more straightforward in terms of his value. It depends on what enemies you're fighting. Can the enemies be sucked up by his burst? And if they can, yes, he's extremely valuable. Just for allowing you to suck up wave after wave of enemies so you can just obliterate them in Raiden's burst. However, if he can't do that, his value drops significantly. He does offer other things. He offers a flat energy boost to whatever element he swirls, including an energy refund to himself, which does come in handy when you compound it with Raiden's own energy refund mechanic. It can often make it so that you can run less energy recharge on your other units and still be fine, because he's ultimately picking up a lot of the slack alongside Raiden. But that's ultimately all there is to say about Venti. If the content is Ventiable, Venti is great. If it's not, then he's very replaceable. Now with Jean, I've already done videos where I've used Raiden and Jean together. I've done like 2 of them, I think, now, actually. So it should come as no secret that I think they work quite well together. Even before Dendro, she had the value of being the healer option in double Hydro teams with Yelan and Xingqiu, allowing you to run Raiden as the on-fielder because she ultimately doesn't need a shielder when she's using her burst because she can't be interrupted, but you're still taking damage if you get hit, so having a healer is important. And in single-target teams, crowd control isn't as important, so you don't necessarily need to run these 2 units to keep enemies together, because if it's single-target, the enemy's just going to be right in front of you anyway. And if they're not, then it's a boss that's jumping around all over the place and CC won't work on them anyway. Well, in that case, it's less important that Jean's crowd control is... It is there, but it's not terribly reliable. Like Venti, it's very enemy-reliant. If they're Fatui enemies, or humanoid-like enemies, then Jean's crowd control is actually quite strong. But it can also take quite a bit of field time and might not necessarily be something you want to do. Ultimately, that's what she's there, not what she's there for. She's there to heal, and her heal is very strong, which matters all the more when you're using her with Furina. Furina made Jean's value go up quite significantly to the point where running Furina and Jean together is a potentially more valuable option than a stronger hydro damage dealer and Kazuha. Because Furina's damage is quite strong anyway, but there's also the fact she's offering a considerable damage bonus buff, which is stronger and less conditional than what Kazuha will offer. So, well, in that case, it's the healing you want to make sure that you have in order to enable this incredibly strong buff. Well, that's what Jean allows you to have, alongside the Viridescent Venera buffing. The other characters I can mention here, Sayu has a lot of similar qualities as Jean, although what I would say about Jean is that Jean does have a different quality in terms of self-swirling the character, which can have a lot of synergy with Bennett for Sunfire teams. But since those teams are not particularly great these days anyway, except in very specific circumstances, these are probably more interchangeable now than they used to be. Other characters such as Heizo. Heizo has similar qualities to Sucrose, but his buff is not as strong, nor is his CC, so he's generally a less... He's a downgrade, ultimately, but he can still be used in a similar vein to Sucrose, if that's... if you don't have a Sucrose, basically. Farazan, unless you're using her with Zhao or Wanderer, and with Wanderer you don't really use him with Raiden anyway, I can't think of much reason to use Farazan with her. Lynette is worth particular mention because she is a free unit. She is given away to every count as an Anemo character, regardless of what you do with main character. And she does have, if I recall correctly, an attack buff, depending on how many different elements there are in the party. Attack buffs are less valuable typically than other kinds of buffs because it's a lot easier to get attack. But it's there. It's ultimately an option that you have, and as an Anemo character she still has access to VV. So I mention that as an option if no other options exist. It will still probably work. Now I've saved Zhao for last in this list of other units listed here, because he does actually have a team with Raiden. It's just a very odd team. It's a bit like a Eula dual carry team, where you spend field time on him and then you swap to field time on Raiden. And it has similar problems, I feel, in terms of extending rotations. Eula doesn't typically suffer from that as much because there's downtime in Eula teams anyway, where you're just wanting to generate energy. But with Zhao you don't have that, so it does actually extend the rotations. It's typically made up for by the fact that Raiden's energy generation time is also her damage dealing time. However, the issue can be in terms of, well, who's receiving the buffs. And in a Zhaoden team, it's typically Zhao, because if you're not buffing Zhao, then why are you using Zhao with Raiden in the first place? Why not just make a Raiden team? So in those cases, I can recommend it only, A, if you really like using Zhao, but you have trouble managing his energy costs, and B, if you have other dual cores like Bennett Zhanling or Albedo Zhongli that can either offer a good amount of damage throughout both Zhao and Raiden's field time or offer utility to both units. It's not a team I particularly like, I just figured I'd mention it as an option because it might be one you're not aware of. Alright, so now we reach the end where we are basically just wrapping up and discussing the characters that have particular synergies with Raiden and the other remaining elements, which are Pyro, Cryo, and Geo. Let's start with Pyro because Pyro has the most of discussion and the most relevant ones of discussion. So we have Bennett. I assume at this point you know what Bennett does, but if you don't, what he essentially does is he provides one of the strongest attack buffs in the game, which is a considerable amount of attack. He also provides a strong amount of healing for the on-field damage dealer. He is a fantastic Pyro battery for another very powerful Pyro character, Zhanling. And his only real drawbacks are you have to work within his circle if you can't snapshot his buff, and some enemies move out of the way, and you also apply Pyro to yourself, which means certain enemies can trigger reactions on you. But ultimately those are very minor drawbacks for a character that just gives you so much damage. If you're running Raiden in a burst damage team without it being like Taser, or without it being, well yeah, any non-Dendro Raiden team that's not Taser, you will want Bennett. That's end of story, basically. It'll be significantly worse without him. And then you have Zhanling, who is almost always paired with Bennett because of her ability to snapshot, that is to say, retain the buff for longer than she should, and even when you're outside of the Bennett circle. But the reason she's good is just that she does an insane amount of burst damage off-field with her Pyronado, which lasts for a considerably long time, 10 seconds at C0, but 14 seconds at C4. And every single hit will trigger reactions, including Overload and Vaporize, which is relevant for Raiden National, because you are triggering both of these reactions with Zhanling. And yeah, that translates to a lot of damage throughout the rotation. Like, per hit, it's a lot of damage, but you're also doing those hits for at most 14 seconds, which is a considerable amount of time. So Zhanling does work exceptionally well with Raiden, and that's why Raiden National is such a common team. Although I would say, without Bennett, Zhanling is considerably worse, but even then there are some situations where you can use Zhanling without Bennett. But if you have these two together, they work exceptionally well with Raiden, especially since you'll probably also have Shincho, or you can pick him up from the shop when he's in rotation, or from the Lantern Rite festival that will happen in the next patch. So other than that, the only other Pyro character that has particular synergy with Raiden is the latest one they released on her banner, Chevrus. Chevrus basically allows you to play without an Anemo character if you can afford not having the CC, and if your team is mostly consisting of Pyro and Electro characters. If that is the case, though, I would say probably her best team is one that does include Zhanling, and by extension Bennett, with Raiden. And that reason is that her uptime on her skill, well not her skill, her passive, this one right here, it requires the on-field character to be triggering Overload. But in order to consistently do that, if you're on-fielding with Raiden, then you need off-field Pyro application as well. And you can't use Jean to do that because she's an Anemo character and this doesn't work, so no Sunfire. You could use Toma for his shield and his off-field Pyro, but you don't really need a shield too much with Raiden, and you're already being healed with Bennett, so why not Zhanling, when Zhanling can benefit from what Chevrus does, as well as Raiden. So she does have use case with Raiden, otherwise she wouldn't really be released on the banner with her. but at the same time, it's a particular niche. It's not necessarily worth doing over other teams. It just gives you an option that's quite good, even if it's not necessarily the best for the content you face. For the current Abyss with the Hydro Tulpa at the end of it, she is actually quite good, because that boss always has a Hydro Aura, which means that unless you're doing Corpus Swirling, you can't actually shred Pyro resistance. You can shred Electro resistance, but that's taser stuff. But Suffice just allows you to stack Pyro and Electro. You'll still be able to vaporize, and you'll still consistently have Electro and Pyro resistant shredding. Something which is extremely difficult to do without Suffice. So there is that. Another one that I guess I could mention is Dea. Like, she technically does have synergy with Raiden for buffing her burst damage, but her burst damage sucks anyway, so I wouldn't recommend doing that. However, she does have another use case where she is triggering Burgeons and using only her skill, if you use her alongside Hyper Bloom Raiden and you have Nouvelette, because it allows Nouvelette to get some forward vapes on his attacks, while at the same time allowing Dea to trigger some Burgeons. Nouvelette benefits from her interrupt resistance that she provides, and you're still getting Hyper Blooms from Raiden and the support that Raiden offers. So there's that, but that's a particular niche that requires specific characters. Now, among the Cryo characters, there's only really one that's worth particular mention, and I'm going to talk about her now, because it's very easy. She basically has the same synergy with Raiden as Xiao does, except that she does benefit particularly from the burst damage buff, which Xiao does not. She benefits from the energy generation that Raiden provides when she's on field doing her burst. She benefits from the superconductor reaction, and she does have downtime which allows for Raiden to take up field time without it really extending the rotation. However, Eula teams, even with Raiden, are not particularly great because of all of the drawbacks that Eula has, in terms of you need to be able to hit your crit on your burst, otherwise you lose a lot of damage. If the enemy moves out of the way, then, your burst can potentially hit nobody. All of those things basically mean that I don't recommend using Eula or Raiden unless you particularly want to play Eula. For further details, just see my Eula guide, because much of the information on there still holds up, with only a few extra things I could mention, like, say, for example, the existence of Shenhe or of Mika, but that doesn't really change all that much in terms of Eula's viability. As for Geo, there's only really one Geo character with particular mention, and that's Zhongli, and he's even easier to discuss. He provides a shield and resistance shredding. Those things are generally pretty useful. It's just, is it worth him taking up a character slot to provide those things, especially since Raiden doesn't really need the interrupt resistance that he provides. He mitigates a lot of damage, or negates it really, but at the same time, with sufficiently strong healing, you don't really need to worry too much about it. So that concludes my thoughts on the character synergies with Raiden, with my own experience of having played her since her release back in 2021. I really like this character a lot, if it didn't show from the sheer amount I've been talking about her. So I hope if you were interested in pulling for her in this patch, that I've given you some food for thought in terms of teams you can use her in and what characters you can use in teams with her. And if not, then I hope you found what I've said interesting nonetheless. So I will leave it there, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'm not sure what I'll do next, but you'll know when I know, I suppose. See you around.
Dear is but a backdrop of constant motion.